Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. So far, is everything working? Okay, then I start. Mystical Love in Philo of Alexandria. Philo of Alexandria is probably one of the most influential Jewish thinkers of the ancient world, leading Chadwick to the famous dictum that the history of Christian philosophy did not begin with a Christian, but with a Jew, Philo of Alexandria, elder contemporary of St. Paul. We know unfortunately little about his life, yet some recent studies such as Niehoff's Philo of Alexandria, an intellectual biography, try to shed light on his Ciceronian and Platonic influences and step into all the footsteps walked already by scholars such as Wilamowitz, for whom Philo is a Hellenized Jew, tried to defend his Judaism against the Greeks, or Leisegang, for whom Philo was primarily a Greek philosopher who saw Judaism with Greek eyes. What we know is that Philo was approximately born between 13 BC and 44 AD. As a member of one of the most prestigious families of the ancient metropolis of Alexandria, he led an embassy to Emperor Caligula after struggles between the Jewish and Greek population. Flavius Josephus refers in his Antiquitatis Judaici to this event, calling Philo highly famous. Today, the Alexandrian scholar is lesser known for being the brother of Alexander, who was a stepson of Agrippa I and a high financial officer who sponsored the golden fittings for the Herodian temple, than for writing several volumes of allegorical commentaries on the Torah, reading the texts as if they contained deeper wisdom about the life of the soul. As I have suggested in my doctoral dissertation about Plato's inner man, I would like to introduce Philo in my contribution foremost against the backdrop of his Jewish faith. Such a spiritual turn, as I have suggested, starts with the reader's religious background at first and then tries to see how these religious ideas have shaped philosophical thought, rather than to fix on one philosophical school and try to press him into categories that are foremost governed by a modern understanding of philosophy and less by an overall concept of philosophy as the love of wisdom. Talking about love then ultimately brings us to the topic of this conference. What can Philo as a mystical theorist then contribute to the concept of love? Since Philo provides us with allegorical interpretations on the Torah that are highly situational, I try to avoid to create a Philonic system here. Therefore, I want to invite the reader into 4 areas where in my assessment love plays a role and reveals itself. The first, the human being as natural lover. Understanding human beings as natural lovers presupposes to have a closer look on Philo's anthropology that rests primarily on his allegorical interpretation of the creational accounts that Philo tries to harmonize in his work, the Opificio Mundi. Central is Philo's claim of a double creation that he concludes from his literal understanding of day 1, Hamera Mia, in Genesis 1:3-5. Like an architect who has all the plans in his mind, so God has drafted an intelligible cosmos at the first day. Important is that Philo does not interpret creation chronologically. This means that with the first moment of creation, the entire reality is already present in an intelligible and perfect state. In contrast to Plato, every individual entity has its perfect archetype. This counts also for mankind. According to both creational accounts, one must differentiate between the creation of an intelligible, true and heavenly man and the creation of an earthly man that is imperfect and taken from dust. However, it is only in his interpretation of the creational accounts where Philo differentiates so clearly between earthly and heavenly man. I quote from Van Kooten, "In Philo's understanding, the 2 types of man intersect and overlap as to the accounts of their creation." End of the quote. It is therefore no wonder that the heavenly man is in some passages identified as a distant prototype, in others located in the human being, identified as Adam, as a wise man, as a prophet, as conscience, or as human mind. It is important to understand that it is only this prototype, the heavenly man, or better, the idea of the individual human being, that is created after the image of God. The true image of God, who is for Philo radically transcendent, is the Logos, the ruler of the universe. Philo derives this from the literal wording of Genesis 1:27, where one reads that man was created kat eikona tiu, in the image and likeness of God, kat after the image, the literal wording in Greek. Leaving this literal interpretation a bit aside, we can say that Philo follows from these two accounts a double perspective on human existence. One that wants to see it under the rubric of its perfection, that is the heavenly man, and the other under its fragility, that is the earthly man. As our human existence, both intermingle. Therefore, it is no wonder that Philo identifies this heavenly man in most of the passages he interprets with our reason, or better nous, as the Greek term for an intuitive concept that is capable to understand the truth of this world as wisdom. Following this line, we can now try to answer what Philo might have to say on the human being as natural lover. I would like to suggest that it is a rather negative concept that the reader encounters in these passages in Genesis. Love foremost reveals itself as an awareness or experience of what is missing, ein Bewusstsein von dem, was fehlt, to quote a famous title on a discussion with German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. Interpreting the creation of Eve in Genesis 2.18 as a description of the most natural love relationship, Philo speaks of the yearning, Greek, ephigetai, or longing of the heavenly man, the nous, reason. I quote from the allegorical interpretation, start of the quote, for the man made after the image, it is not good to be alone because he yearns after the image. For the image of God is a pattern of which copies are made, and every copy longs for that of which it is a copy, and its station is at its side. End of the quote. By contrast, the earthly man, the mind that is intermingled with the body and fragile, receives Eve as sensation. The passage goes on, start of the quote. Far less it is good for the man molded of the earth to be alone. Nay, it is impossible, for with the mind so formed, linked to it in closest fellowship, are senses, passions, vices, 10,000 other presences. End of the quote. It is this idea with which Philo tries to explain the unfulfillment of this longing. Let us turn therefore to the fall of mankind in Genesis 3. With the earthly mind bound to sense perception, the danger for corruption becomes imminent. Consequently, Philo identifies the fall of man through the serpent with the arousal of pleasures that have access to the mind, to the nous, via sense perception. In other words, via Eve. Start of the quote. The movement of pleasure, as Philo says, is like that of the serpent, is tortuous and variable, and ultimately leads pleasure, outwits and misleads the mind, showing objects not as they are, but as they are not, keeping the true human self, the heavenly man, trapped in longing and yearning of its fulfillment. It is this context in which a tyrannical form of the errors that tortures the soul appears. I quote here once again, start of the quote, but none of the passions is so troublesome as covetousness or desire of what we have not, things which seem good, for they are not truly good. Such desire breeds fierce and endless yearnings, anenitos erotas. It urges and drives the soul ever so far into the boundless distance, while the object of the chase often flies insolently before it, with its face, not its back, turned to the pursuer. End of the quote. This quote naturally leads us to the second dimension of love in Philo of Alexandria, love and knowledge. We need to keep in mind that Philo is anything else but a Manichaean or agnostic. Speaking of this rather negative concept of love as inscribed in human nature is neither the consequence of a punishment nor a negative view on the bodily existence of mankind. The earthly and bodily existence is all in all object of God's creation, and as he explains in another passage, this condition serves good to reveal himself as the only one upon the whole creation ultimately rests, as Zeller suggested. Speaking about the dependence from God, we find the key to turn this negative concept into a positive and foremost mystical concept. The heavenly man, the nous, thus is able to fulfill this longing with the right knowledge about our reality, since, and I quote, drunkenness, we saw, does not only signify folly, which is the work of this rejection of discipline, but it also signifies complete insensibility. And the body, this is produced by wine, but in the soul by ignorance of things of which we should naturally have acquired knowledge. End of the quote. So what is this knowledge all about? And I quote from another passage from the Ebrietate. In the first of these utterances, he asserts that there is no God. In the second, that even if there is a God, he is not known to us. And this conclusion presupposes the assumption that there is no divine providence. For if there were such a thing as providence, God too would be known. End of the quote. As becomes clear in other passages, Philo seems to address a kind of intellectual arrogance, which is for him nothing but the normative consequent of a mind that is longing for truth, but has forgotten the true cause of the universe and is drunken, as he says, with the immediate reality that one perceives as truth without any further questioning, following, start of the quote, the instability and waywardness of the opinion based on likelihoods and plausibilities, end of the quote. It is all about recognizing one's own status as a creature like Adam, and Philo says that is the mind, for he names and apprehends other things, gives no name to himself, since he is ignorant of himself and his own nature, end of the quote. Achieving this intellectual habit, and I want to stress that intellect here should not be seen as an analytic concept, but overall noetic, intuitive mind with regard to wisdom, brings us now to our third dimension of love, the experience of mystical love. Recognizing one's own limits and existential dependency from God now opens the mind to experience love in a mystical way. An important category is thus the intellectual openness, humility towards God and his creation. The reader is therefore invited in a dialectic between the right knowledge about God, intellectual humility, and the world, the experience of beauty, and love in a mystical way that reveals itself. In Philo's understanding, knowledge and beauty are in a dialectical relationship. The former implies recognitions of God's supremacy. The latter has the power to lead us to the truth, and truth is marvelously beautiful as falsehood is monstrously ugly, as Philo says. The individual affected by beauty has an insatiable desire to be filled with things that are beautiful, as Philo says. Yet beauty is more than just an attitude of true opinions. Philo speaks at another place about beauty inflaming the lover's soul with a fire that burns all the passions. And I quote, "For the lover of virtue, set on fire by the brilliant appearance of the beautiful, to Kalu fantasias, burns up the pleasures of the body and then chops and grinds them up." At another place, Philo even recommends taking refuge in moral beauty as soon as any of the love lures of pleasures invite thee. It needs to be clear, though, that it is God who alone is beautiful. Therefore, every experience of creational or moral beauty can only fully be understood in relation to the Logos, whom the mind ultimately desires, and he provides the highest possible knowledge of God for us earthly human beings. The earthly-minded man thus is transformed by this dialectic into a hoper. And I quote here, "Since the first step towards the possession of blessings is hope, and hope, like a high road, is constructed and opened up by the virtue-loving soul in its eagerness to gain true excellence, Moses called the first lover Erasten of hope man, thus bestowing on him as a special favor the name which is common to the race, on the grounds that he alone is a true man who expects good things and rests firmly on comfortable hopes." Philo describes this hoper also as the man of progress, prokopton, who stands between perfection and imperfection and can be compared to a sailor who still has not reached the harbor. In this sense, it was the experience of divine love that has led Abraham to leave his homeland. In Philo's words, and I quote, mastered by his love, eroti for God, he mightily overcame all the fascination expressed in the fond terms of family affection, and told the divine call to none of his household, but taking out of his numerous following to only the oldest and most loyal, he went forth with his son, four in all, as though to perform one of the ordinary rites. End of the quote. But it needs to be clear that God is the source of this experience. Philo says, it is necessary that the soul should not ascribe to itself its toil for virtue, but that it should take it away from itself and refer it to God, confessing that not its own strength or power acquire nobility, to kalon, but he who freely bestowed also the love of it, ton erota. This leads us to an interesting aspect of Philo's mysticism, and I think it would lead too far to stretch that any further, but I find that really interesting, given its yearning and desire for the divine and the interior experience of divine love. The heavenly man in each individual is at some passages also identified with the statue of a deity, and Greek agalma. I quote here, a sacred dwelling place or shrine was being fashioned for the reasonable soul, which man was to carry as a holy image of all images the most godlike. End of the quote. He does that in other passages as well, describing interior movements, interior affections with the Jerusalem temple. So he invites his readers into this kind of imagery to explain interior movements and also things that we can't explain. This leads me to a conclusion. In this short paper, I try to introduce 3 dimensions of love in Philo of Alexandria. Starting with his allegorical interpretations on the creational account, Philo confronts us with an ideal of human existence, the heavenly man, and its realistic, fragile condition that confronts us with a negative and even tyrannical concept of love expressed in yearning and desire for this true human self, for the divine. Confused with many pleasures, mystical love can only take rest in the human soul when the human mind frees itself from the arbitrariness of wrong opinions and a right understanding about the transcendence of God and his providence. Becoming open for the true reality of our existence, the man of progress experiences a dialectic of right knowledge and beauty transforming this negative love into hope that ultimately leads to the experience of mystical love, transcending the capacities of our thought and authored by God alone. Even though one must always remember that his allegorical interpretations are deeply situational and would probably mislead to create a Philonic systematic, it is striking that Philo himself applies the temple in Jerusalem at several passages to the human soul, revealing himself as a Jewish mystical master whose dialectic of mystical love reminds us at some places of the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola and other spiritual writings in the Western tradition, talking about sudden consolation and desolation by God. All in all, it is only this love that can truly fulfill the soul, lead us to an ethical, authentic life, and the realization of our true self. In Philo's words, for he has given myself to me and everything that is to itself, since I will establish my covenant with thee is the same as I will give thyself to thee. And it is the earnest desire of all the God-beloved, Hoitiophilais, to fly from the stormy waters of engrossing business with its perpetual turmoil, surge and billow, and anchor in the calm self-shelter of righteous roadsteads. End of the quote. Thank you for the attention.